Good morning, students. Welcome to your English literature class. The topic for today's tutorial is A Face in the Dark. In your previous video, you learned the summary, characters, and critical appreciation of the chapter A Face in the Dark. Today, we will read the text. By end of this video, you will be able to understand the meanings of difficult words, express the story in your own words, and answer the related questions. Students, now open your treasure trove book at page number 74, chapter number 5, A Face in the Dark, written by Ruskin Bond. Mr. Oliver, an Anglo-Indian teacher, was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station of Simla. Children, let us discuss the meanings of difficult words. Note down the meanings on your textbook with pen. Anglo-Indian teacher, a person with British and Indian parents. Outskirts, parts of a town or city that are far from the center. In this story, Mr. Oliver is an Anglo-Indian teacher. He is the protagonist of the story. He was returning to his school late one night on the outskirts of the hill station Simla. From before Kipling's time, the school had been run on English public school lines, and the boys, most of them from wealthy Indian families, wore blazers, caps, and ties. Wealthy means rich. Mr. Oliver was working in a school that had been run on English public school lines. Children, underline Kipling's time. What do you mean by Kipling's time here? Rudyard Kipling is an author. Here, Ruskin Bond is talking about the time even before when Rudyard Kipling was born. The boys who studied there were from rich Indian families. They wore blazers, caps, and ties.
Life magazine, in a feature on India, had once called it the Eden of the East.
Mr. Oliver had been teaching in the school for several years. Feature means an article in a magazine. The school in which Mr. Oliver was teaching
had been described as Eden of the East
by Life magazine.
Eton College is an English medium school for boys in Berkshire, UK.
The East refers to the eastern part of the world. Here in story,
the school is called Eden of the East
as it offers similar kind of quality education for boys from upper class in eastern parts.
It is also a boarding school like Eton College. Children, underline Eden of the East.
Children, it is a metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech that compares one thing to another without using as or like.
Here, the comparison is made between Eton College
and the most elite public school in Simla where Mr. Oliver taught. The Simla Bazaar, with its
cinemas and restaurants,
was about 3 miles from the school, and Mr. Oliver, a bachelor, usually strolled into the town in the evening, returning after dark, when he would take a shortcut through the pine forest. When there was a strong wind, the pine trees made sad, eerie sounds that kept most people to the main road. Children, write down the meanings of difficult words on your textbook. Bachelor, a man who is not yet married. Strolled, to walk in a slow and relaxed way. Eerie, strange. The Simla Bazaar was 3 miles from his school. The bazaar
had various restaurants and cinemas.
Mr. Oliver, who was a bachelor, usually took a leisurely walk in the town in evening. When strong winds were blowing, the pine trees made strange, mysterious, frightening sounds, as a result of which people usually kept to the main road. But Mr. Oliver was not a nervous or imaginative man. Children, underline the word nervous. Nervous means afraid about what might happen. Imaginative.
Having a lively imagination.
But Mr. Oliver was not nervous. He was not even an imaginative man. He carried a torch, and its gleam, the batteries were running down, moved fitfully down the narrow forest path. When its flickering light fell in the figure of a boy who was sitting alone on a rock, Mr. Oliver stopped. Boys were not supposed to be out after dark. Children, write down the meanings on your textbook. Gleam, light. Fitfully, not regularly or continuously. Narrow, less wide. Flickering, shining unsteadily. He carried a torch with him. The batteries of torch were running low. Children, here
Mr. Oliver was carrying a torch with him.
he moved down the narrow path without getting nervous. When the flickering light fell on the figure of boy, Mr. Oliver stopped. The boy was sitting alone on a rock. Mr. Oliver was surprised to see the boy sitting alone at that time of night in the forest. Children, why was he surprised? Because the boys were not supposed to be out after dark. "What are you doing out here, boy?" asked Mr. Oliver sharply, moving closer so that he could recognize the miscreant. Recognize means to identify. Miscreant, one who causes trouble. Mr. Oliver went closer to the troublesome boy in order to recognize him. He asked the boy what was he doing there. But as he went closer to the boy, he felt something was wrong. But even as he approached the boy, Mr. Oliver sensed that something was wrong. The boy appeared to be crying. His head hung down. He held his face in his hands and his body shook convulsively. Children, write down the meanings of difficult words on your textbook with pen. Approached, came near. Sensed, realized, appeared, seemed, convulsively, irregularly. The boy appeared to be crying. His head was hung down and he was holding his face in his hands.
His body shook suddenly and irregularly.
It was a strange, soundless weeping, and Mr. Oliver felt distinctly uneasy. "Well, what's the matter?" he asked, his anger giving way to concern. "What are you crying for?" The boy would not answer or look up. His body continued to be racked with silent sobbing. "Come on, boy, you shouldn't be out here at this hour. Tell me the trouble." "Look up." The boy looked up. He took his hands from his face and looked up at his teacher. Children, note down the meanings of difficult words. Weeping, crying, distinctly, clearly, uneasy, worried, concern, worry, racked, to tremble while crying, sobbing, crying with sudden sharp breaths, trouble, problem. Mr. Oliver felt clearly worried. Mr. Oliver asked the boy what was the matter. Now Mr. Oliver became more concerned. His anger changed into concern. He asked why he was crying. The boy neither looked up nor answered his questions and continued to cry with sharp breaths. Mr. Oliver again told the boy that he shouldn't be there at that hour. Mr. Oliver again inquired from him what was troubling him and asked him to look up. The boy looked up at his teacher. It was a strange, soundless weeping. Children, read the first line again. It was a strange, soundless weeping. Children, what do you observe here? Strange, soundless weeping. Here, the consonant sound S is repeated in strange, soundless weeping. So, it is alliteration.
So, children, what is alliteration? The repetition of consonant sounds in words that are close to one another is known as alliteration.
The light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, if you could call it a face. It had no eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. It was just a round, smooth head with the school cap on top of it. And that's where the story should end. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end here. As the light from Mr. Oliver's torch fell on the boy's face, he was stunned to see that the boy had no face. He was without eyes, ears, nose, or mouth. It was a round, smooth head with a cap on top of it. So, children, that's where the story should have ended. But for Mr. Oliver, it did not end there. The torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and scrambled down the path, running blindly through the trees and calling for help. He was still running towards the school buildings when he saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. Children, note down the meaning of difficult words on your textbook. Trembling, shaking, scrambled to move quickly. Lantern, a type of light with glass sides. Children, you can see the lantern in the picture. Mr. Oliver got frightened and the torch fell from his trembling hand. He turned and ran blindly down the path through the trees, calling for help towards the school building. While running towards the school building, Mr. Oliver saw a lantern swinging in the middle of the path. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. "What is it, Sahib?" asked the watchman. "Has there been an accident? Why are you running?" Stumbled means tripped. Gasping means breathing in a fast way. Mr. Oliver stumbled up to the watchman, gasping for breath. The watchman asked Mr. Oliver if there had been an accident and why he was running. "I saw something horrible. A boy weeping in the forest and he had no face." No face, Sahib? No eyes, nose, mouth, nothing? Horrible means terrible. Mr. Oliver told the watchman that he had seen something horrible. A boy weeping in the forest and he had no face. "Do you mean it was like this, Sahib?" asked the watchman and raised the lamp to his own face. The watchman had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. And that's when the wind blew the lamp out. The watchman inquired if he had no face. Mr. Oliver emphasized that the boy had no face, no eyes, no mouth, nothing. At that moment, the watchman raised the lamp to his own face and asked Mr. Oliver if the boy's face was like his face. The watchman too had no eyes, no ears, no features at all, not even an eyebrow. Raised means lifted up. Features, facial features are being talked about here. At that point of time, the wind blew the lamp out.
So, children, the story is an open ended story for the readers to imagine what would have happened to Mr. Oliver after that. So, children, this brings us to the end of today's tutorial.
Do the homework given in your SNAP homework. Thank you.